title is How People Use and Appraise Concepts. And the idea is that I will speak to you about some of my research, some of my findings. I'm not expecting that you'll know many of the results that I've achieved over these years. And then I'm particularly talk about this work with Nick Shea that we did over the last 2 or 3 years on this ERC funded project. This is Safira, who did a lot of the work. She was the postdoc on the grant, and then she was a psychologist. Julia and Jake were the philosophers on the project. And I'll also put a picture of Alessia here, who is another colleague who's been working with me for many years. And I'll be describing some work that we did on individual variation in concepts. I think if we want to know about how to engineer, how to change concepts, we need to know about the flexibility, the variability that there is already in the world to get some idea of where to apply the spanner, what sort of resistance we're going to meet. So let's see if that's not going to work. Right. So the overview of the talk, as I say, something about everyday vernacular concepts, how I think they relate to the world, society, and the individual. And I'll be coming back to that in a bit halfway through the talk. Beginning with some back pages of my own work, a number of phenomena that I have established, which I think point to the nature of concepts as there's the man on the Clapham omnibus, or the everyday person uses them in their everyday speech and language. I have some ideas about conceptual engineering and the different types of concepts there may be, which may need different approaches in terms of their conceptual engineering. And I'll end by giving you some new results from this project with Nick Shea. So at the bottom here, I've tried to show you furniture, pets, fruits, vegetables, professions, tools, games, and sports. These are all categories of events or objects which have at various times people have thought that these may have some kind of prototype structure. And I've spent about 50 years, actually, it's 50 years since I began this work as an undergraduate. And for some reason, it's been so fascinating that I haven't varied from that particular goal. And now that I'm retired, I'm still trying to find out new things about it. So it shows that these noun concepts like tools and games and sports are flexible, evolving, they change with context, they serve functions there. The reason that they're adaptive and flexible is that we can bend them to the message that we're trying to say. So that if we're talking about exercise, we can use sport in a particular way. If we're talking about watching television, we may use sport in a different way. And this leads to there being many overlapping possible concepts for what sport is, depending on the context in which you're communicating. And this is terrific in terms of creativity. One of the things that's always said about the European Union is that at the end of the long negotiations, and gosh, Britain has just been doing them for the last endless years, you don't really agree at the end, you reach for the fudge. That is, you find a form of words which each side thinks expresses what they mean, without taking too much trouble about whether it actually the other side means the same thing by it. And you hope that when the bureaucrats get together to try and work out the details over the next 6 months, that somehow the compromise will be made more realistic. So it's the ability of words to mean one thing to one person and another to another that actually is the fundamental of this kind of diplomacy and this ability of nations to actually come to any sort of agreement where you don't draw red lines in the sand, if you can draw a red line in the sand, but you actually move forward by pretending that you agree. There's also the possibility, of course, that when it really matters, when you want to know whether or not you've inherited some money from someone, or whether you've committed a crime, where the jury has to decide whether or not you've crossed the rules, then we have to stipulate exactly what we mean by particular concepts, and then this flexibility can be greatly restricted. So if you look at the practice of law, you'll see that there's still an awful lot of discretion available to the judge in terms of how they interpret the rules, how they may try to think of the intent of the parliamentarians when they made the law as to whether this was particularly what they had in mind. So there's still a lot of flexibility even in stipulated concepts. So I'm going to argue that, let me just take a little sip of water here. that a lot of our everyday concepts have this kind of prototype structure, going back to Roche. I originally talked about polymorphous concepts going back to Gilbert Ryle, who there's more of a philosophical origin, that they're vague, that you tend to understand that, you know what you mean by art, but do you actually know at what point something ceases to be art? The boundaries are just not stipulated in the concepts that we possess. They're polysemic. So what exactly is a school? Is it the institution? Is it the building? Is it the pupils? Depending on which context you want to use that word in, it can mean all of those different things. And they're very convenient because they allow you to express all these different meanings. Now, as well as prototype words like game, famously Wittgenstein's example, we also have natural kind terms, we have social kind terms, which are more fixed in their extension, in their reference, and they may be embedded in partial causal schemas. We know that people have some idea about how things work, and this is part of their concept. It's not just a matter of categorizing things that are similar to each other. These kinds of terms we would tend to defer to experts. So if we want to know what arthritis is, to use Tyler Burge's example, we'll say, well, probably I should ask someone who's in the medical profession to tell me just exactly what arthritis is, and not try to make up my own rules about it. And even for everyday things, as Rosenbrith and Kyle have shown with their illusion of explanatory depth, we believe we have too much confidence in how much we understand how things work. And I was just going to give an example here from a wonderful paper by Rebecca Lawson at Liverpool University, which she wittily calls psychology. And it's about how you build a bicycle. And you might like to think, if you had to draw in the frame and the chain and the pedals, just where would you put them? I actually had to look at my bicycle when I was preparing these slides. So here are some of the results from her participants. And these obviously were the ones who picked out because they were in error. And in fact, some, like participant C here, claimed that she cycled every day to work. But her idea of the way the bicycle is constructed is when you actually, you say, of course I know what a bicycle looks like. Of course I could draw one, but when you actually come to it. So I put you out of your misery. The frame goes like that, it's two triangles. And then of course the chain and the pedals go between the lower point of the triangles and the back wheel. So we have this sense of our concepts that we really understand everything. And that's what concept appraisal research is going to be looking at. It's just, it's not about whether you actually have the right depth of understanding that you think you do, but how do concepts differ in terms of how much you think you understand them and how stipulated and serious they are, as opposed to just how they are words in language, which you can use pretty much as you choose in a Humpty Dumpty sort of way. So I'm going to tell you now about some results from my research program over these 50 years, beginning with an early one, that when you ask people to categorize or to say whether it's a case that one subcategory is included in another, that you can, not always of course, but you can find intransitive cases. So if people are asked, is a car seat a type of chair? They will say, yeah, that's pretty sure. Is a chair a type of furniture? Chair is a very typical kind of furniture. But is a car seat a kind of furniture, a type of furniture? And people will say, no, that's not the case. What do we conclude from that is that this kind of is a type of, or is a kind of, is not actually underwritten logically by a class inclusion as you would imagine it should be. It's not the case that all chairs are a type of furniture, because there are exceptions like car seats, which are included. What we're doing when we make these category judgments is not looking at the extensions and whether they are one reference set is included within another. What we're doing is looking at what I call the intention. I don't know if that's a kind of psychologist's idea of an intention. We're looking at the properties that we associate with those concepts. We're saying chairs are things you sit on, and they have a solid base and sides and a back. Car seat fits that, no problem, it's kind of chair. And then we're saying furniture is something that you find in the house, and it can be moved around, so it's not fixed to the wall, and it serves various functions, convenience and comfort and so forth. And a chair, it obviously fits right in there. But the car seat doesn't have those features of the furniture, and therefore it misses. So it's to do with mapping these properties together rather than looking out in the world and counting mental models of what sets are included in what sets. It's also interesting that if you look at these subcategorizations, like it's a kind of, it's a sort of, they're also the same words, at least in English, that were used for expressing vagueness. It's kind of, well, it's sort of, which I don't want to make anything of that. It's just a curious coincidence, I suppose. It's also, as I've said before, natural kinds do, it's much harder to find intransitivities in, say, Linnaean taxonomy because they've been built not to be intransitive. If you have a biological hierarchy of classes, it creates a lot of trouble if you allow things to not be included in this set above. And that allows you to create this, like Collins and Quillian, cognitive economy hierarchy of everything at one level, inheriting all of the properties that are associated with the class above, which I guess goes back to Aristotle. You would know more about it than I would in that case. And Anna Wiedspitzka, who strongly recommend looking into if you're interested in meaning and concepts. Back in '84, she had this wonderful paper, Apples Are Not a Kind of Fruit, where she argued that in fact there is a whole range of different underlying logical semantic relations that can be expressed by is a kind of. Collections, proper concepts, other sorts of things. And in her case, apples were of a different kind from saying like oxygen is a kind of element or something like that. Some more intriguing phenomena. This is to do with conceptual combinations, in particular using relative clause modification of a concept, which at first sight, again, a bit like the intransitivity, you'd suspect that it's just picking out a particular subclass. A machine that is a vehicle should be in the general category of machines, and then you find the ones in that category which are vehicles. But here we have, in my data, 54% people say that a lift is a vehicle, but 82% say that it's a machine that is a vehicle. So those are clearly incompatible beliefs. If you add negation, it gets even more extreme. So 80% will say a desk lamp is a type of furniture. 74% believe it's a household appliance that is not furniture. So you give them a better category, household appliance, and now they don't really want to put it in furniture anymore. And this one with disjunctions, a mushroom, 50% will say it's either a fruit or a vegetable. But if you ask people, is it a vegetable? Only 1 in 10 will say that it is. If you ask, is a mushroom a fruit? Nobody wants to say it is. So something is going on here. The apparent logic of these expressions in our language, disjunction, relative clause modification, just not behaving the way that it appears they ought to transparently in terms of the appearance. So what is going on? Well, as I said before, with the intransitivities, I think it has to do with combining sets of properties. So supposing you want to form a conjunction of two concepts, two categories, and they each have a definition, what you would normally do is to add together the two definitions. So if something has to be a delivery truck and it has to be Polish, then it has to have all the defining characteristics of being Polish and the defining characteristics of a delivery truck. So the intensional properties, you form a disjunction of them in order to create the conjunction of the extension. Now, when you try to do that with these vague, flexible concepts, then you get an interaction, you get conflicting between features which can't coexist in the same time. And this, in contact with real knowledge, this leads to something I call inheritance failure. A famous example, of course, is the pet fish, Olscherson and Smith in 1981, and a lot of philosophers have also talked about pet fish. The problem there being that a guppy or a goldfish is a highly typical pet fish, but it's not a typical pet and it's not a typical fish. So if prototype theory is right, what is going on? Well, if we look at some features of fish, they swim in water, live in lakes, they eat them with chips. especially in Scotland, I guess. And then features of pets, they have owners, they need to be fed, they're warm and cuddly, and they're affectionate. Now, when you put these two things together to form a pet fish, you can't have all of those 8 features together. In fact, you can only have the top 4 if you want to say these are pet fish. These ones down here, they're true of fish that are not pets. You do not eat your goldfish with chips. And down here, these are the pets that are not fish, because even if it comes to the surface to be fed, it's really just classical conditioning. It's nothing to do with the fact that it loves your face and wants to be affectionate. So what has happened is you've put the 2 sets of features together, they've interacted with each other. The fact that you can't have 2 of a kind, can't have 2 values on the same attribute, which are at conflict, means that you choose one and not the other. So it has to be cold and slimy and not warm and cuddly, because it's more important to a fish to be cold and slimy than it is for a pet to be warm and cuddly. So the pet feature has to be dropped out and you stick with the one that is more necessary. So that's the fundamental idea of my model of this conceptual conjunctions. You can do a similar job with the mushrooms and the disjunctions. Everything's in reverse, of course, with the disjunction. You want to form the conjunction of the features of each side. The things that are true of both will be things that are true of either in the set. So up here, you've got features which are diagnostic of fruit. They contain seeds, have a peel, but they're just not true of mushrooms particularly. Here are things that are true of vegetables, particularly being green and so forth. And down here, you've got things which are diagnostic of both. And these then are the features that you tend to have left when you're thinking of whether it's either a fruit or a vegetable. Well, what do those 2 categories have in common that I might be able to judge against? And since a mushroom is vegan and it's edible, and you find it with the radishes and the lettuces and the other things in the supermarket, it very easily put into the either fruit or vegetable category. Even though when it's asked about each one of it separately, the fact that it doesn't have these seeds, or the fact that it isn't green, it doesn't get boiled and put on the plate with your meat, means that you don't want to put it in either of those categories on their own. So that's, again for time, yeah, about 25 minutes or so. So that's some of the phenomena that I've been interested in bringing out, and the evidence that I put for there being this prototype structure, that when you want to say what is fruit, we don't try to do that in an externalist way of just determining in the Encyclopedia of Biology just what a fruit is. It has a definition, but that's not the one which people tend typically to carry as the meaning of the words that they use every day. What they do is to think of it as a collection of properties which are mutually correlated. So if a particular plant has one of these, it's more likely than not to have another. This is Roche's idea of the conceptual structure in the world. And you build together this similarity-based property category based on these underlying properties. And when you make combinations of conjunctions, disjunctions, negations, then interesting things happen at that property level, which then lead to the categories that you end up looking at seeing. Now, with Alessia here, we did some studies in Sicily, in fact, on individual variation in concepts. And I just wanted to tell you a little about these before coming on to concept appraisal. We're really interested in whether, if you look at a particular individual, first of all, do they have a stable view of the world? Supposing you have to take a list of 12 sports and tell me which are the most typical down to which are the least typical. You have to rank them in order. So you might well start, depending where you live and what your culture is, you might put soccer near the top, and you might put, say, one of those alpine sports like curling way down near the bottom. And in between, you've got all the rest of the tennis and the basketball and the other sorts of sports. If I get you back a couple of weeks later and ask you to do it again, which is something Larry Barcelow did back in the 80s, you find that intriguingly, people change their mind quite radically. So something that was top of the list last time might be near in the lower half next time. It shifts around quite a lot. And so we were really interested in whether, given that, there still are individual stability individual variation between one person and another. So this is what we did. Participants were given two tasks to do. First, they were given, this was for a number of categories, but say with sports, they were given 12 types of sport, which they had to rank order in terms of which are the most typical for them and which are the least typical. And we explained typicality meant it was representative of sports as a category, I think something like that. And then they were given features which people had generated in previous experiments for sports, such as, does it involve physical skill? Does it involve exertion and exhaustion? Does it require stamina and endurance? Is it competitive? Is there special equipment involved? Are there teams? Do you have spectators? Do you have competitions and international championships and so forth? So a whole range of properties true of sport, and you had to rank order those in terms of which you thought was the most prototypical, which is the most diagnostic or important for being a sport, contributing to something's typicality as a sport, down to the one that was least. So you did this. So you did this task for like 4 categories: first the typicality, then the features, and then you came back a few weeks later, and you did the whole thing again. And you were told, just don't worry too much about what you said last time. Just tell us what you feel about this today. And there is obviously correlation between the 2 occasions, because things don't change that much, and people's opinions they change, but they don't change that much. But what we were interested in was the similarity between people. So we had this cunning way of trying to see whether there's individual stable variation. So if you look at the similarity matrix that you take, for example, people's judgments of the rank order of sports as being typical, I have 20 participants, I can correlate each participant's ranking with each of the other. So the first one with the other 19, the second one with the other 19, and so on, to create a matrix of correlations, which are similarities between any pair of people, one on the row and one on the columns. So down the diagonal, there are a series of ones, because everyone's perfectly correlated with themselves on that occasion. I can look at that similarity matrix, which it is. It's two people have the same, very similar ranking. They'll have a high correlation. And I can compare that with the same thing 2 weeks later. Now, if 2 people were very similar in their ranking to begin with, and that is stable, they should still be very similar in their ranking 2 weeks later. And this is what happened. So there is this reliability to the degree of similarity or dissimilarity between individuals within the group, indicating that some people have systematically different views about it than other people. So that's the way we were able to handle that. And this was true both for looking at typicalities of items, like is wrestling, how typical is wrestling as a sport, and for the typicality of features, whether or not physical skill is an important aspect of sport. So in both of those cases, there were these reliable similarity patterns that you find between one occasion and the next. What was really surprising and quite upsetting for a prototype theorist was that these 2 matrices, one for the typicality, one for the features, did not correlate with each other. Let me just let that sink in. So if 2 people, Fred and Joe, have a very similar idea of the ranking of what is most typical as a kind of sport, they're just like anybody else in terms of their similarity, in terms of which features they think are most important. This is really quite curious. You'd think that the people who put billiards and chess and archery at the top would think that skill must be the most important thing. The people who put triathlon and marathon things at the top should think that endurance is the most important thing. But they don't. So they may have very similar ideas that endurance sports are the most typical, but when it comes to which features are most important, they may be different positions there. Their 2 rankings correlate no more than any other pair of people. So that's kind of result that you get in psychology where it makes no sense, but you have to publish it anyway, because we did it 4 times, and they're just, we could put a limit on how strongly those correlations should be, and it was very low. We were able to show the reliability of our data and so forth. So it seems to think that maybe different something different is going on when you're judging typicality. Maybe it has also to do with familiarity, to do with liking, to do with closeness to ideals, to various other things that have been suggested, maybe affecting typicalities. And what you can read out from your concept in terms of the features and how important they are may not be actually what you're using when you're categorizing and doing the typicality judgments. So that's just to throw that in there. So let me turn then, just take a breath. To some ideas that I've had about conceptual engineering. Now, I'm very much an ingenue in this field, and I know that you guys have been listening to lots of talks already this term and last year, and have been doing lots of research on this, so you'll have to forgive my naivety if I say things that make no sense. But what I did was to relate it to some ideas that I'd had about how we keep our concepts honest. That is, how do we know that we're using the correct concept? Which I know is something that Jerry Fodor talked about a lot, the problem of error. One of the criticisms of prototype theory as well. If your concept just is what you have in your head, how do you know whether it's the right one or not? And if two different people have different concepts, there's no argument between them. They just have different concepts. How can we have a debate about what the concept should be or what the right answer is? And I think this leads you to a kind of hierarchy of honor or conscience or something, that there are selective pressures from three different sources to try to keep us honest in terms of concepts, or in terms of having our concepts linked in to something which leads to stability, which leads to consistency and consensus about what concepts actually are, what these terms should refer to. And I've divided it into three domains, which you could think of as levels, because they're kind of harder at the top and softer at the bottom. So clearly, the kind of real externalist definitions of things like iron or physics, things like energy or momentum. We have a scientific theory that we've developed over many hundreds of years. We've had many failed attempts to come up with good concepts that have gradually been replaced by more successful concepts. Through the method of science, we've got a fairly good idea about what we mean by a good concept in terms of its generality, in terms of its making useful predictions, in terms of avoiding contradictions and so forth. And that's why we've lost lots of things like phlogiston and the ether as theories in physics, and come up with strangeness and quarks and other things which are much less easy to understand, but we feel that are better concepts to make the right predictions. At a second level, there is human society. And so I can have a concept which is incorrect, not because it's referring to the wrong reference set, but because I'm using the word in a way that other people don't. So that's another way of looking at it, is that if I talk about a particular type of music as grunge, and my children say, "Dad, honestly," or my grandchildren say, "Dad, honestly, Granddad, honestly, that's not grunge." It's not because there is a clearly defined category or set of things that is grunge and is not grunge. It's because I'm just picked up the word. I probably don't have no idea what it's supposed to refer to, and I'm just using it to try and impress people by my knowledge of something that was in fashion 30, 40 years ago when I was still middle-aged. So we have this requirement to try to use words the same way as other people do. When my daughter was about 5 and she was learning new words, she would say, we would correct her on her use of a word. She'd say, "But I can say that if I want to." And we'd have to say, "Well, of course, yes, you can say that if you want to, but people like me are going to continue to tell you that you're not using it right." Okay, so if you want to avoid that inconvenience, then you might want to think about using it a different way. So there's this socially constructed communal meaning, which is about people and their relations, and it's not about an externalist world, it's about an externalist social world, if you like, where the reality is something that is partly constructed, partly real. It's in this area of sociology where exactly what the fundamental epistemology and ontology is very flexible and difficult to pin down. Built into that is knowledge, power, social control, politics, the spin doctors, the way that messages are constructed, the way that people in power manage to greenwash or whatever it is they're doing at the time to try to change people's concepts and to get people thinking of things in a way that suits them. And then also at this level is institutional stipulation. So you can have groups, professional bodies coming together to define and stipulate exactly what we mean by different things, like in economics or in social health care or whatever it might be. There are notions of vulnerability, of due process and due diligence, which are accepted and developed by institutional stipulation and example. And then at the bottom of this hierarchy is most of the concepts that we use most of the time, which is that we are aware of our need to be kept honest by connecting to these other areas. But at the same time, we have personal choices, we have personal preferences, personal ways of using words and so forth, which just reside in our own minds. And we may even have concepts of our own, which we use to categorized experiences during the day, which we've never really bothered to explain to anybody else. And they really are just self-referential. They're just about that feeling I have when I see this, or whatever it may be, may not even have a word for it. So down here we have kind of thinking and thoughts. Here in the middle, it's, I think, perhaps easier to think about these as lexical meaning rather than concepts, because it's, a lot of it is about how language is used that creates these concepts and these conceptual things. You are getting the wrong, you're getting it wrong because you're using the word in the wrong way, not necessarily because you have the wrong concept. Whereas at the top here, you can clearly have the wrong concept. So this is just summarizing the world. You've got natural kinds, you've got deference to expertise. A lot of, I'm always struck by how a lot of people talking about concepts just don't think it worth mentioning that we actually make children go through about 10 to 15 years of school in which teachers are every day trying to get them to change their concepts, trying to get them to understand concepts in a different way. And that it's not surprising that they end up understanding things in a way which people 100 or 200 years ago would have had a completely different understanding, completely different concept of. In the real world, conceptual engineering happens as part of scientific process. We find better ways to make concepts and distinctions, to stipulate things, which gives us these modern types of concepts like mass and weight, or weight and density, heat and temperature, waves and particles, which allow for better science. And socially constructed concepts, and I've got much too much information on my slides here, but when you're talking about conceptual engineering, I think it's more about the use of particular terms. So this is kind of wokeness, perhaps. It's picking on particular phrases, particular terms, and saying, well, this is like gender and sex. There's a huge amount of debate, just how you pin those down and what they relate to each other. And it becomes very, very imbued with political agendas. And so conceptual engineering is very much needed in those sorts of areas to try to get clarification, but also to try to get consensus on just exactly how we should be using these words. It allows for creation of pejorative terms. This is happening all the time between groups that are in conflict with each other. They're creating new ways of stereotyping, new ways of dissing the other. Words like wokeness or antifa or these various sorts of things are examples where an in-group can feel that they understand each other by creating new concepts which are negative about the out-group. And then personal concepts, I would include here those cases which philosophers have also been looking at, where there's no fact of the matter, we're each entitled to our own opinion. So whether you like Wagner's music, whether you think it's good or not, may be a matter that I can think it is good and you can think it's not. And even though we may debate it, we each pretty much have to accept that the other, like, you like it, I like it, and you don't. It's just we can agree to disagree about certain things because they're not matters of fact. And those would be more at the personal level of concepts, that I have a conception of something that is like this, your conception of it is like that, but we're each entitled to our own individual concepts. There's nothing that has to say that you must share the same concept of these things. In terms of conceptual engineering, it occurred to me in preparing the talk that psychotherapy has a lot to do with conceptual engineering, and particularly the development of therapeutic methods, of ways in which you can explain to your client as a therapist why they're behaving the way they are, why they're feeling the way they are, what they can do about that, how they can change their way of thinking. Cognitive behavior therapy is very much about giving people new concepts with which to explain to themselves their desires, fears, addictive behaviors, feelings of despair, whatever it may be. And so those kinds of concepts are being engineered by psychotherapists to try to help people to create a conceptual structure which makes it easier to live and form relationships and get on with life without being emotionally overwhelmed. So let's move on. I won't say very much here, except I think there's a story to be told, and I haven't tried to tell it, but within these realms of the science, the social and the personal, concepts can move up and down, of course. In particular, psychiatric diagnosis has not yet achieved the level of other medical domains where you can say that, say, malaria, we know exactly what it is, we know how it works, we know what we can try to do to cure it or to prevent it. Schizophrenia is horrible. We still have very, very different means of diagnosing it. We're really not sure if it's one thing or many things. The same with autism, the same with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are lots of these things which come into fashion for a decade or so, and then people find another way of trying to categorize, trying to explain the problems that people have in their mental health. In DSM-4, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, they deliberately took a descriptivist approach to diagnostics. That is, they listed a set of properties. If you have hallucinations and social isolation and this and this and this, if you have at least 4 out of those 8 symptoms that have lasted for more than a month, then you get this diagnosis. So very clearly descriptivist prototype approach to the concepts that you're using. That's in the latest version 5, they're trying to move away from that and hoping that some kind of underlying neurological facts of the matter will be detected, will be determined, which will say that if you have this particular thing happening in this part of the brain, that means that you've got this particular condition. But we're a very long way from, even with the brain imaging that we've got, from being able to really track those things down and pin diagnostics down to that. And things can come down. Pluto, you're very familiar, I'm sure, how Pluto is no longer a planet. It's a dwarf planet, which has thrown astrology out the window, rather. But it's a case where apparently it was extensional. It was certainly an externally determined thing. A planet is one of those 9 things that's going around the Earth. And that's things that are similar to that in other worlds. And then we realized that Pluto actually was just one of a class of many, many things of a similar size. And if we were going to have Pluto as a planet, we'd have an indefinitely large number of planets, which would then make life very difficult using that word. So we have a separate category, which just makes life easier for the astronomers. And they did decide this just by consensus. They had some meetings of the International Society to make this determination. So I've not left very much time, but let me move right on to how people appraise concepts. So this is the study, the studies that I did with Nick Shea and the other team, Safira, Jake, and Julia. And Nick and I sat down and we thought, well, how can we get at what people think about their concepts? And after several meetings, we came down to 2 ideas. One is, I may feel that I understand some concepts very well, whereas other concepts in my vocabulary I may really have not much idea about. So I may know what it is to be a clothes designer and have a good idea about what they do and why they do it. A homeopathic therapist, I may have very little idea as to what their practice is, what their aims are. And the other is a feeling of dependability or legitimacy. Some concepts seem like they are deep, fundamentally full of interesting theory and knowledge, like being a police officer, involves lots of rules and regulations and training and things that I don't know very much about, but that I'm sure my appraisal of the concept is that it's a very deep concept. Whereas being a dog owner seems, well, you have a dog and that's about it. There may be some other things, prototypical things that I can attach to it, but it doesn't seem like a very deep concept. So we set about trying to find that out. I'll just skip over this because this will come clear. We used a method that we took from Nick Haslam, looking at essentialism in social categories. That is, you take a number of dimensions, a number of questions that you can ask about a concept, and then you see which ones correlate with which other ones. In this case, they had questions about social categories like being disabled, supposed to being normally abled, being old versus young, being male versus female. And they asked people these 9 different questions. To what extent is it discrete? Can you have borderline cases as opposed to has to be one or the other? How natural is it? Can it be changed? How stable is it? Is it are there things about it which are necessary, and so forth? And they got collected data with people rating all these different dimensions for these 40 social categories and looked at the correlation using something called principal components analysis, which tries to boil down the 9 different dimensions into a minimum number of dimensions that are varying by showing which ones correlate with which others. And here they found that these first 5 all correlated together. So the factor number 1 is a made-up dimension which maximizes the square of these correlations here. They should have a point in front of them if there were correlations. And factor 2 picked out the other 4. So what it says is these 5 things are measuring one aspect of essentialism, and these 4 things are measuring a different aspect of essentialism. So that the concept of something being essentialist, a concept being essentialist, comes down to 2 different types of concept. One being how natural it is, essential things are natural, and the other being its thingness or entitativity, which has a remarkable number of T's in it. That is, that it's uniform, informative, it has an inherent structure, and if you're in this, then you're unlikely to be in other categories. So we used the same idea with 8 dimensions of concept meta-feelings, metacognitive feelings. And I'll just go through these because this is really the meat of it. So how confident do you feel you could explain the category to someone else? And we're going to be looking at diseases and fruits and professions and things like this. How sure are you that everything you know about the category is true? How much you think you know about the category, from very little to a lot? How likely are people to understand each other using these category names? Is it kind of bullshit, or is it really something that can really be understood? How much does knowing something belongs to the category tell us about it? If you found out that 3 members of a category have a characteristic, how likely is it that other members would also have that characteristic? It's inductive potential. How long will it take someone to become an expert in this category? Very quick, or take a long time? And how likely would you be to defer to an expert about this category? That's assuming there is such a thing as an expert about dog owners or something like this. So those were our 8 dimensions. And we got people to rate those dimensions for 4 different domains of concepts with 40 items in each: people, recreations, health, and then plants and animals. And about 50 people rated those 4 domains on each of those dimensions. So the dimensions were independent groups did the different dimensions. So they hadn't first decided if it was informative and then decided if it was inductive. They just did one of those things. And we did the factor analysis, the principal components analysis, and we came out with a very nice picture with 4 things on the first component and 4 things on the second component. And this is a component plot. And you can see that over here, to do with understanding, was can you explain it? How accurate is your understanding? How much do you know? And how useful would it be for communication? Whereas the second one, which we call dependability, is its inductive power. If 3 members have a property, then another one would too. It's informative. There's an awful lot to learn about it. and you would defer to an expert. So two different dimensions on which our categories get appraised by people. At that point, the story looked great. And then we started digging a bit deeper and looking into, well, first of all, we made the wrong predictions, which was kind of nice. If you want it to be real science, you have to make a wrong prediction sometimes. Otherwise, you're just finding evidence for the ideas that you started with. We had thought that whether you could communicate should be some kind of a dependability measure, but it actually clustered strongly with understanding. And we thought deference to experts would be an understanding measure. I don't really understand it, so I defer to someone else. But it actually turned out to be dependability, which makes more sense. If there's a lot to learn, then there's going to be experts, and you would need to defer to them if you don't understand it very well. But then we looked within different domains, and all sorts of things tend to happen. It may be we've got 40 items, so these correlations are calculated across the 40 items. Participant data has all been collapsed into a mean for each item. So for people, there was this, you've got these 4 here and those 4, but how much you know also tended to go with whether it was dependable. So the more dependable something was, the more complicated the profession, the less likely you felt you understood it, which makes some sense, but it's just for this people one. This is to give you an idea. I don't know if you can see that on your screens, but these are all the different 40 items that we had, ranging from ballet dancer, priest, and genius, which were the most deep, dependable concepts, over to tea drinker, library user, voter, which were the least dependable in terms of being informative or inductive potential. And at the top, the things that are most well understood, dog owners, students, and police officers. And down at the bottom, the ones least understood, legal clerks, homeopathic therapists, and connoisseurs. Recreational activities went pretty much the same way as the top level, so that worked pretty well. We had things that were most dependable, where there's an awful lot to learn about it, mountaineering, scuba diving, ski jumping, things which are at the other end, tic-tac-toe, that's noughts and crosses, building sandcastles, barbecuing, things that people didn't understand very well, bridge and dinghy racing and backgammon, things they did, jogging and swimming and camping. Health conditions, we had 2 of these things which should have been on the dependability moved across negatively into the understanding. Without going into a lot of detail, in health, most health conditions have expertise. And in particular, the things that you understand well are likely to be the ones which are the deeper ones. So you're going to get a negative relationship between being able to understand it and whether or not that means that you would defer to experts. If you understand it, you don't. If it's something like a sneeze, then you don't defer to experts necessarily, whereas, or dandruff or something like this. If it's heart murmur, then you wouldn't understand it and you would give those things. And then these are the examples of health. We had Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis, very complex. Dandruff, sneezing, sunburn, irritability as being uncomplex. Common cold, nut allergies, understood. Chest pain, glaucoma, high fever as being, and if you remember this, things like, can you explain it to someone else? And maybe people are thinking in a different way of that sentence, of that question. You get a feeling for how tricky this sort of research is to stop the questions from changing as you've changed the context. Plants and animals, you ended up with 2 different dependability dimensions, one including informativeness and induction, and another to do with expertise and how much to learn. So we had expertise, things like parasite, arthropod, amphibian, they tended to be really technical things up here, giraffe species up there, and down at the bottom, lawns and cereals and pond slime and bush are low in expertise. You wouldn't necessarily have an expert on cereals or new potatoes, but maybe you would, but much less than you would on arachnids. And then inference, high inference on the right. If something is an oak tree, then you expect other oak trees to have the same properties and it to be very informative to know it's an oak. If you know something is a pet, it doesn't tell you very much about it, or that it's a bush, it doesn't tell you very much about it. So what we have is the idea that the feeling of understanding, these first four, tend to always correlate with each other across different domains. But the others tend to break up depending on which domain you're looking at. So we don't really have an underlying dimension of dependability. What we have is four different ways of measuring dependability that sometimes correlate with each other, sometimes don't, depending on the domain that you're looking at. We looked at more domains, sports, fruits, clothing, furniture, and once again, you get feeling of understanding, all 9s in here pretty much, but the others breaking up into different clusters for the dependability. So that's just summarizing what I just said. Okay, fairly quickly now, we're just a couple of slides left. We followed up with some other studies, which I won't have time to tell, but this is one which is quite fun. We took this from Andrea Patalano and Brian Ross's work. So psychologists studying personality noticed people have one of two types, X or Y. And in her study, she found 80% of police officers were type X, 80% library users had type Y. Now, Sam is a police officer and a library user. So which personality is he most likely to have? And when you pose that question, you find that the sort of depth dependability dimension is the one which leads to your choice. In this case, police officer would tend to drive the thing. So you'd say Sam has type X because being a police officer is more predictive of everything about Sam than being a library user. How familiar you are with the concepts, you're equally familiar with library users and police officers, but when you vary that, that doesn't drive the choice of which one is the one that Sam is likely to have. Okay, so why is this relevant to conceptual engineering? I hope you'll be able to tell me some of that after the break. I think knowing as much as we can about people's use of concepts, how they vary, how they change, is going to be an important foundation for thinking about how we can improve concepts, how we can change everyday discourse, how we can change social media, whatever is going on in there that's causing so much trouble, and turn it to good. If we can seek to increase a feeling of dependability on the concepts which are dependable and decrease dependability feelings about those which are not, that would be very helpful. Also, raising self-awareness about when you do or don't understand something well would be very important. I think a lot of the time we talk about things assuming that we understand them until we actually run into someone who does, and then, oh my gosh, yes, I had no idea what I was talking about all this time. And I think it particularly relates to how we devise curricula in higher education, how we develop critical thinking skills. It's about getting the students to think about their concepts, getting them to appraise their understanding of them, particularly in social sciences, appraise which concepts are going to be useful for social science theory, which ones we need to ditch because they're leading us in the wrong direction. So I will thank you there and return to the chair.